Now it's recording. So we will share the link with you, and feel free to forward that link on to others as well, so that they can also learn from the session that we're going to have here. You also please feel free to type questions in the chat. As always, with webinars like this, when we have a lot of participants and a lot of questions, it's hard to get to all of them, but we've got a number of people helping to keep an eye on the chat, and with Ingrid moderating, we'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. Also, there will be a very short survey mid-webinar for you to answer. If you could just take a look at those questions, it's very quick questions to help us gather baseline data. As you can imagine, as part of this project, the monitoring and evaluation of the progress that we're making, whether folks are understanding what we're trying to achieve, and whether we're making change in justice systems is extremely important. So we'll have this pop-up survey, or I believe it will be in the chat during the webinar. And then also, I think in a day or two, you'll receive a longer follow-up survey as well, where you can give feedback about this entire session, what was useful, what are other webinar topics that you would like to see in the future, things like that. So if I could ask in advance your cooperation in filling out both of those to the extent that you're able, it will really help us to be able to continue to work effectively on this project and make sure that we're including as many opinions, suggestions, recommendations of the key stakeholders as possible, which all of you are the key stakeholders. So thank you again. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ingrid Elliott, who is our moderator, and as I mentioned, the innovation and the brains behind the Stigma Toolkit. Thank you, Ingrid. Over to you.
Thank you, Christy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'd also like to add my warm welcome to everyone today who's joining us. I'm delighted to be here. It's been a little bit time in coming, and we postponed this from a previous date, so feels really good to be here today with so many participants. I believe this topic is incredibly important. And it's something that really we need to start to have more conversations about and grow awareness, and really start to tackle this issue in our justice systems. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to start by explaining what we mean by stigma in justice. I think often when people talk about the impact of stigma in justice, they focus mainly on the underreporting and the barriers that survivors face when trying to access justice. The silencing of survivors by stigma and the internalized fear of stigma. And of course, this is a huge barrier to justice. But today, we also want to recognize stigma in a broader sense. And we want to talk about the impact of stigma in the justice process and on justice outcomes. So sexual violence stigma includes prejudicial, stereotyped, and false beliefs and attitudes about sexual violence, about characteristics and responses of survivors, and of perpetrators. We recognize that stigma manifests in knowledge, in attitude, and in practice. Firstly, as knowledge in false beliefs, in misconceptions and stereotypes. Secondly, in terms of attitude, as prejudicial and emotional reactions. And thirdly, in behavior and conduct, usually as discrimination towards others. It also occurs at multiple levels. Institutional or structural stigma, community or social stigma, interpersonal and interactional stigma, and internalized stigma in survivors themselves, and unfortunately is often amplified. Our focus today is not just on stigma's barriers to accessing justice, but how stigma and its misconceptions, prejudice and discrimination embed systematically into our laws and our justice systems, how it influences justice actors, their decisions, their assessments, and their actions, how it drives high attrition rates and poor outcomes for conflict-related sexual violence and sexual violence justice, and incredibly importantly, how it harms and re-victimizes survivors during their interaction with justice actors and the system itself. I want to share a quote from the invaluable ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal book on lessons learned from prosecuting conflict-related sexual violence. Here's the quote. It is imperative that international criminal justice actors commence an honest and well-informed discussion about the misconceptions and the seriousness of conflict-related sexual violence. These misconceptions are a reality that any prosecution office in the future will have to grapple with. One of the most fundamental lessons learned by the Office of the Prosecutor is that dismantling misconceptions is key to improving accountability outcomes for this category of crime. So the objective of this first webinar is to start that discussion or continue that discussion, to amplify this issue, to encourage discussions about how to counter stigma injustice, and to introduce you all to some of the tools that that Synergy has developed to tackle stigma, and to invite collaboration in testing these tools around the world and improving them. We'll start today with a panel discussion with some extraordinary women working on this issue. And after the panel, I'll very briefly introduce some of the tools that have been developed, and my colleague Lisa will talk more about potential collaborations and an invitation and call for partners. We'll then open the floor and hopefully have good time for some audience contributions and questions. Throughout the webinar, please do feel free to use the Q&A function. It's there at the bottom of the screen, hopefully, and we'll keep an eye on that and come back to it when we get to the audience participation section. So moving on to the most important part, the panel discussion, we're delighted to have such an incredible group of women experts to discuss the effects of stigma injustice and how the toolkit has already been used in some pilots to tackle that stigma. Our first panelist is Priya Gopalan. She's an international criminal lawyer expert, and she specializes in gender and intersectional justice. Priya, it's a real honor to have you with us today, and I'd like to ask you, as a criminal prosecutor at the ICTY and as a leading gender and intersectional justice expert, please share your experience and research on how stigma impacts access to justice and the process of justice itself.
Thank you very much, Ingrid, for that kind introduction. And thank you also for the opportunity to participate in this incredibly important webinar. Now, let me jump straight into your question, Ingrid. How does stigma impact access to justice and the process of justice itself? Now, as we know, there are many barriers that impact the ability of survivors of sexual violence in accessing justice and the quality of justice they receive, if at all. Now, in my view, stigma attaching to sexual violence is one of the most pervasive and powerful barriers. Now, this is because, as you've already mentioned, stigma and myths, misconceptions, harmful gender stereotypes, and unconscious biases that are all related and mixed when it comes to matters relating to gender and sexual violence. These collectively create barriers to reporting, and also when it comes to accessing justice, inflict secondary victimization for those who brave the justice process. Now, we know that sexual violence disproportionately affects women and girls. However, other persons, genders, and groups are also victims or survivors of sexual violence, and they may face different or more specific manifestations of stigma and misconceptions that relate to particular aspects of the identity. All to say that we cannot forget the intersectional dimensions of sexual violence and how the intersectional dimensions inform or are drawn from different aspects of a survivor's identity. And this can then result in a different manifestation or different manifestations of violations. Now, for example, the stigma faced by an internally displaced woman who is trafficked for sexual purposes could be different to the stigma faced by a sex worker who is raped and is accessing the justice system. Now, regardless, stigma is institutionalized in all of our criminal justice systems, and it influences the decision-making and discretion of many justice actors. Now, the actions, behaviors, attitudes, and decision-making processes are mired in misunderstandings, biases, rape myths, which blame and shame and ultimately hinder an objective, safe, and effective justice process. The result is discriminatory, and this is a universal and persistent problem across different justice systems and courts. And these stigmatized attitudes that we see in domestic processes is also seen in international accountability processes for international crimes. Now, what are these harmful gender narratives or stereotypes or biases that drive stigma? I'd like to highlight one strand today in this webinar, this idea of honor, dignity, chastity, and modesty, the narrative of female morality and sexual purity, which permeates the naming and articulation of sexual violence across diverse cultures. Now, in many parts of the world, the concept of honor is constructed around notions of female virginity before marriage and sexual fidelity after. And sexual violence is perceived to cause irredeemable destruction to this deeply gendered notion. To give you an example, in Tamil culture, the relationship between chastity and rape is clear. The commonly used word for rape in Tamil language literally translates to the destruction of chastity. Katpalipu, it's called. Let me give you another example. Chris Dolan, in his report, War is Not Yet Over, Community Perceptions of Sexual Violence and Its Underpinnings in Eastern DRC, writes that a villager in Eastern DRC described the stigmatization of fellow villagers who survived sexual violence in the following way. If someone lives without honor, she or he dies on a daily basis. This answer was in response to the question, is it worse to be shot or to be raped? In light of these entrenched social perceptions of stigma attaching to sexual violence, it's unsurprising that stigma is a barrier for survivors to access justice. Victims and survivors may not come forward to testify or to provide information because they fear bringing shame to themselves or to their families, or investigators might assume that victims and survivors will not wish to testify for this reason. Now, in domestic systems, estimates of underreporting range between 6 to 20% of sexual offenses, which this is an estimate as was reported, and conviction rates for those cases which are reported are documented to be as low as 1 to 6%, including in well-resourced, well-developed criminal justice system. And when I was working on conflict-related sexual violence in Syria, women who reported, who had experienced sexual violence, reported feeling responsible for dishonoring their family, and for this reason, concealed the sexual violence they endured. This is, of course, conduct that is found across many societies. Similar experiences can be found amongst the victims of sexual slavery by the Japanese military during the Second World War. It is well documented that these victims were regularly treated as outcasts, considered spoiled goods, and blamed for failing to prevent the crime. And as a consequence of the stigma attaching to this crime, many of these women did not report their violations, and they endured the silence of sexual violence for almost 50 years. What I found also on my work on stigma is that while stigma relating to sexual violence is time-worn, we've spoken about a more recent conflict in Syria, we went back to the Second World War. What is clear is that while stigma is time-worn, the ways in which it is exploited continues to evolve with time and technology. Now, one example of that is an example from the conflict in Sri Lanka. Now, while working with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in Sri Lanka, it was reported that perpetrators recorded the rapes of survivors on mobile phones and used the threat of making these recordings public to ensure the silence of survivors. Now, this combination of technology and stigma then condemned survivors to silence and in some instances trapped them into a vicious cycle of violence. It is therefore not surprising that there is almost complete impunity for conflict-related sexual violence in Sri Lanka. Thus, stigma binds many victims around the world in a covenant of silence. Sexual violence can humiliate and terrorize, and it is these very characteristics that secure many victims' silence and consequently perpetrators' entrenched impunity. It's often said that the silence and denial arising from stigma attaching to sexual violence is one of the biggest barriers to holding perpetrators accountable. Now, turning to the justice process itself. For survivors who brave these barriers, speak out and provide testimony, many face re-victimization and stigmatization in the justice process. How does this happen? For example, when victims and survivors are asked why they did not fight back, what role they played in what happened, these stigmatized victim-blaming misconceptions deepen a victim and survivor's own internalized questions of self-blame. As Ingrid mentioned, stigma can also be internalized. Another example of re-victimization is assumptions of authoritative statements that are made about a victim or survivor's shame that feeds a cycle of shame and ostracism on the part of victims and survivors. I came across several examples of this while researching recent prosecutions before the Bangladeshi International Criminal Tribunal for conflict-related sexual violence committed during the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971. Now, let me wrap up with an example of this. And this is a quote from one of the cases, a quote from the transcript. Our social pattern does not allow a woman to prefer bringing a false accusation of yellowing her supreme honor, as it stamps stigma on her life and makes her social and family life devastated. Thus, we find no rationale to doubt the testimony of victims. Now, characterizing rape in this manner places victims in the unenviable position of having to tout their personal humiliation in the context of this society to be accepted as a credible witness. There can also be other complications when survivors who require and consent to their identity being protected do not receive adequate protection. And this can have significant and even deadly repercussions. Unsafe pregnancies, honor killings, trauma that can lead to suicide or self-harm. Now, to conclude, we've seen how stigma permeates the justice chain from the outset right until the end. Let me conclude with a quote from Kelly Askin in her article, Comfort Women, Shifting Shame and Stigma from Victims to Victimizers. This was an article she wrote in 2001. It is the shame and stigma wrongly attached to victims of sex crimes that is the primary reason that silence surrounds the crime. And yet this silence distorts the truth about the prevalence and viciousness of the crimes, exacerbating efforts to redress the crimes and probably perpetuating occurrences of the atrocities. Unless the negative stereotyping of sexual violence is reversed by relocating the shame and stigma of the victims onto the perpetrators and others responsible for the crimes where it belongs. The obstacles in establishing accountability and developing means of preventing and remedying this crime will continue to be hindered. Now, this sentiment is echoed by Gisèle Pellicot, as we know, the French woman who has become a feminist hero for insisting that the rape trial of her ex-husband and 50 other men should be held in public. She said to a court in southern France that her desire to have the trial in public was to change a society and to expose rape culture. And I end with this quote: "It's not for us to have shame, it is for them." Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. That's an excellent overview of just how stigma really, as you say, permeates end to end from the very outset before criminal justice can even begin until the outcome. Thank you, Priya. That's excellent. I'd like to ask the second question to Nadine Tunasi. Nadine is one of the UK's Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict survivor champions and experts, and she was a central member of the Synergy Toolkit expert team. Nadine, as a member of the expert team who developed the toolkit and as an expert facilitator during the first South Sudan pilot of the tools, could you please share with us your thoughts on why the toolkit is valuable, and also share your experience with engaging with survivors to discuss their lived experience of accessing justice in South Sudan?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ingrid. And really thank you for connecting me to this project. Thank you to the Synergy team for all your support and commitment for this work. I want to say that when working on this, the more I read the research around the experience of survival, the more I found myself thinking about what more we could do to ensure that the experience of those who were trying to seek justice were better. I'm saying better experience on purpose. And the reason being is that justice is better delivered when the whole process was person-centered. And in the context of conflict-related sexual violence, I would say survival-centered. I live in the UK and was recently looking at some data on survival of sexual violence here to find out about the experience. And it is reported that an estimate of 1 in 6 only have the courage to report sexual violence. And for those who report, the finding had a 73% have said that the police treatment worsened their mental health. And I'm talking about the UK, a country that relatively promotes human rights and has a developed justice system. I think that if we're seriously thinking about the way, the why so little number of survivors report or even talk about the experiences, we will be leading ourselves into the right direction. In the toolkit, we don't have a list of, the things that go wrong, but rather guidance in understanding what it is that we should be doing so that we do not have the bad outcomes. I believe the Stigma Toolkit for Justice gives us an opportunity to understand that delivering justice is not only about having the perpetrator locked in prison, but rather about ensuring that when a survivor or victim chooses to pursue justice, all justice actors need to be equipped with the knowledge and understanding about whose justice they are delivering. I also believe that it's important that we deliver justice better, not only for survivors, but also for the community in conflict zone. A survival-centered approach means that survivors have a better outcome, ensuring that evidence is collected properly and survivors have a better experience. I had been thinking about a few words that I can bring to you, for this webinar, that sort of like helped me frame the way I reflect, on the work that we did on this project. And I can talk about person, experience, support, and outcome. We can also learn from the toolkit that we cannot deliver justice if we don't have an holistic approach in the way we respond. We can learn how justice is best delivered when survivors are informed about the process and feel that in the process, they have an agency. During the process, they feel that they have an agency to engage throughout the process. We know survivors have rights like any other victim. However, with the tool, we can learn and get guidances about what those rights really look like in practice. First of all, by ensuring that the justice actors are equipped and empowered to put into practice the learning without interference, but also engaging with survivors with dignity and respect. Service provider can work with survivors and assist them not to only be justice recipient, but also co-designer and contributor. Having said that, I'm aware that delivering justice takes the involvement of many people. And whilst I know that the challenges and how much less control we can have on the outcome, we could, however, impact or influence the process that individuals face. The toolkit also guides us on the stigma and its impact. All justice actors and organizations that support survivors can learn how stigma encourages non-reporting practices and serious victim mental health problems. It has a direct impact on community who experience CRSV on a high scale. We can teach each other how to refer to survivors and how language and word use matters. We can all become promoters of the good practices and correct how references should be made and use word and create a more positive language. The other thing that the toolkit does is that it encourages all justice actors to build ourselves and to be equipped, not to be abuser of the position that we hold. It teaches us, especially the justice actors, if not all of us as well, to interpret, how a survivor has experienced or has been impacted by rape based on gender, age, and so on. Moreover, it also provides guidance on non-stigmatization practices and behavioral attitude towards survivor. We can learn about stigma myths and misconceptions and how this issue alone harm the effectiveness and outcome of justice processes, perpetuating impunity and facilitating the continuation of conflict harm, sexual violence. And I just want to say before I finish that, I had the privilege to visit Juba in South Sudan to help facilitate the survivor consultation and quickly notice how stigma contributed to the way survivors perceived the police and understood what the role was, and were not even aware of any of their rights. I've gone there and quite frankly should have known best that in some countries, access to justice and support is a privilege. I noticed how confused survivors were in understanding the role of the lawyers and the one of the prosecutor that they have to play. In fact, access to services was almost in existence, and survivors were not informed, and no one ever explained to them any form of process. I recall a mother sharing her experience when I believe her 7-year-old daughter was raped. She shared how the judge interviewed her daughter, and when I asked how this was done, there was no counseling for the little girl and her family, not any sort of follow-up. And I did question the interview methodology for the child, only to discover that this child was literally interrogated about what has happened to her without any form of support. Another survivor shared how she was gang raped, and when she went to the police, she was reporting her experience standing up for over 4 hours, and the police were sitting down and drinking whilst listening to her. Clearly, this is very wrong. And there are some serious issues in South Sudan, but we know this is the case in many countries of conflict, unfortunately. Having said that, I also understand that the lack of resources is a huge problem. We can use a toolkit like this to equip justice actors, service providers, and empower survivors who advocate about how they should be treated when accessing services. I remember the challenges of a mother who had children born of war. The one that I've talked to were literally telling me how they were struggling to provide for them. This is a community that was very poor, and I asked whether they have seen anyone as a result of rape, and all of them have said no. They seems to have not received any form of support in learning how to cope with the children. And one survivor asked me what she was going to tell her daughter when she asked who the father was. And also the lack of information that survivor had access to means that it has created some sort of confusion. For example, some share how when they reported rape, there seems to be no punishment. When we asked further questions, we quickly realized that they actually were referring to the customary code, which is not bad in principle, but is not the mainstream justice that is fit to actually lead to some sort of convictions. So what happened as a result is that in some cases, the perpetrator were asked to pay money to the families and asked to marry the victim. And I learned how many victims committed suicide because they could not just live with that decision. So you see, we can use the toolkit, this guide, to guide people and build capacity so that they can do their job better. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadine. Some of those messages are just so critical, so fundamental to how we look at this and how we take this work forward. I think, as you said, learning, awareness is the first step to change. And that if we don't take the time to understand survivor experiences, their pathway through these processes, then we really don't understand the harm that's taking place, these multiple forms of harm, and these demands that we actually make on survivors in the process. So Nadine, thank you so much for your insights and your contribution. To build upon Nadine's contribution, I'd now like to ask our third panelist, Alice Soro Kenyi. She is the lead legal aid officer at Stewardwomen. For those of you not aware of Stewardwomen, it's an incredible women's organisation based in Juba, South Sudan, and they worked in partnership with Synergy on the first pilot of the Toolkit in South Sudan last year. Alice, if I can turn to you now and ask you to explain what we have learned about stigma and justice in South Sudan following the pilot, and what your intended next steps are with what you've learned. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, for this opportunity. And to speak before several panelists and other people that are invited, to share my experiences on what I have learned when it comes to stigma and justice, and actually the possible next steps that we intend to carry on in the next pilot. I would start by giving a brief background. In South Sudan, women and girls who have survived sexual violence continue to face significant challenges, including stigmatization and access to justice. And this has been a reality shared by voices and perspective of over 47 women who have survived sexual gender-based violence in locations of Juba, Bol, and Bentiu. With this in mind, between 2023 and March 2024, Stewardwomen, joined by Synergy for Justice, to assess survivors' experience of accessing both the formal and the customary court system in South Sudan. And this was done by using the Stigma Toolkit. So this work centered on workshop with women survivors, listening to and sharing their experiences and listening to others, and the advocacy workshops that were intended to empower survivors network to amplify their voices, to ensure decision makers, policymakers, and justice actors consider their experiences and their recommendations for change and improving access to justice for sexual gender-based violence crimes against survivors of SGBV. So when we talk about stigma, the lessons that are learned, first of all, stigma has been rated as one of the barriers in reporting and disclosing sexual violence by survivors to any, even including the police. And police is a crucial institution when it comes to investigation and even forwarding these cases for prosecution. So survivors spoke of lack of resources and capacity for police investigation, as most cases even end up by statements being taken at the police and even referrals. However, these cases are not forwarded to courts of law. This really stigmatizes most of survivors because that seems there is no justice, and as such, they tend to withdraw their cases at the police level. Survivors in most cases are asked to pay for investigation processes, including paying for water, food, and even transporting the investigators and other people that are involved in the investigation processes. And yet most of these survivors are people that have survived from these crimes, mentally tortured, and they do not have where to go, even they do not have the money to facilitate the processes. There has been more trauma inflicted on survivors, as they have been always asked to even transport the people that perpetrate on them to be produced before the courts of law for the cases to take on. So ideally, it is the obligation of the state to make sure that all the inmates are produced before the courts of law in all criminal matters. But when it comes to South Sudan, this task has been placed on survivors to transport the people that perpetrate on them from the prisons to appear before the courts of law. And this has been one of the aspects and the cause of trauma within the survivors in South Sudan. So there have been a lot of fear and due to appraisals and revenge. And as such, most of survivors have tended to withdraw from their cases due to fear from the perpetrators and even the family where they come from, because most of the families tend to handle these cases within the family level, yet these are serious matters that are clearly stipulated within the statute, and as such, they are only handled by the statutory courts. So this behaviors within our communities and the fear for appraisals has put survivors at a high level of stigmatization, with those that are even willing and hoping to take their cases forward, but because of the fear and even the family threatening them from not taking these cases forward, they have tended to just keep quiet and keep the trauma within themselves. There is societal negative influence in the conduct of the community members towards survivors, as this has been shared by most of the survivors in all the locations of Bol, Juba, and even Bentiu, where one of the survivor women shared her experience that one of the members of the community, as they were passing alongside the road, one was able to point at her, communicating to the other person that they were moving with, that is the woman that was raped last time. And laughters were in between, so she felt unsafe even to stay within the community. So when we talk about stigmatization has been one of the most serious concern within the survivors, and it is still prevalent within the survivors of sexual violence in South Sudan. This requires a multifaceted and analytical approach to dismantle the stigma within the survivors of South Sudan, and also within the justice system itself. In the whole process of justice, from the police, cases being taken to court, survivors continue to face challenges of stigmatization because of the institutions, because of lack of money, and other challenges that I will later share within the access to justice. So the other aspect that now I'll talk about that I've learned is that of access to justice. Marked by decades of conflict and devastation caused by years of widespread of flooding, South Sudan is a patriarchal and extremely unequal gender society, as this has been a reality shared by the Human Rights Council in 2022. With the evidence of high rate of conflict-related sexual violence against women and girls in South Sudan, and during this conference paper, this information was clearly brought out. So there are severe poverty endemic across the country, and this has impacted all sectors of formal criminal justice system, as this was an overview in 2023 by the World Bank in South Sudan. And as such, the courts of law, the police, the prosecution, the prison, and even the special protection unit that take key part in investigating cases of sexual gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence, they are directly involved in the investigation of these cases. They are unfunded and under-resourced. So their salaries come way back after a couple of months. Sometimes they do not even see their salaries even after 5 months and even beyond. So with this in mind, this directly contributes to the rampant corruption that has been reported by the survivors in all the 3 locations that the assessment that was carried out. So this leaves their families who seek for justice with the burden of paying for any fee that is required within the justice system and for their cases to be taken forward. So there is also the issue of medical and psychological and other support service for survivors, which are extremely limited within South Sudan. This has been described by the Commission of Experts for South Sudan as insufficient to deal with the diverse need of women and girls that are affected by the sexual crimes. So this is very important to take note, because medical needs are one of the needs that are very important within the justice process. For instance, I'll give an example of a rape offense that has been committed on a survivor. It is very crucial to have the medical examination, and it is a priority within the justice system. Previously, we had challenges. For you to have a medical examination carried out, survivors were subjected to Form 8. But with a lot of advocacy that went on, there was an order that was released for survivors to seek medical examination even without the Form 8. However, these services within the context of South Sudan, they are really very, very limited, and yet these cases are overwhelming in number. So we also have other challenges that include the limited specialized courts to handle the sexual gender-based violence crimes. As this has been evidenced that in South Sudan, we only have one GBV and the juvenile court, which is situated in Juba. This is the only court that has specialized judges that handle sexual gender-based violence crimes, including the matters related to children. However, this court is only situated in Juba, and it is not situated in the other locations. South Sudan has 10 administrative areas, and this court is only within Juba. So we find that many survivors outside the urban area find it very hard to access the court. And even if they are to access this court, it is very far, too expensive, and very, very dangerous, because some of them, they come from very remote areas that in the way we may not tell what may happen in seeking for justice. So in April 2023, the Human Rights Commission in South Sudan wrote that the reluctancy of survivors and their families in filing complaints with the formal justice system in South Sudan is a well-known, established, and recognized by the justice actors. And this reluctancy is actually pinned on some of the challenges faced by survivors in accessing justice that we have already mentioned. So some of our intended next steps in following the pilot: around November 2024, Stewardwomen, joined by Synergy for Justice, we conducted a 2 workshop, which was based in Juba, Bol, where survivors in piloting the toolkit were involved, and the main participants were those survivors that had taken part in the pilot phase 2, and these pilot phases included the survivor workshop and that of the advocacy workshop. So the next in the piloting the toolkit was done through the 2 workshops in Juba and in Bol, to transform the data that was collected during phase 1 and phase 2, together with that of phase 3, by practically sharing the positive feedback with the survivors of the data that was collected in the 3 phases that involved a number of recommendations, which transformed into the project activity that Stewardwomen is currently working on in supporting survivors, and also directly involve the survivors in developing the work plan. So in my conclusion, I actually want to conclude that dismantling stigma and allowing survivors of sexual gender-based violence in South Sudan requires a multifaceted and analytical approach by directly involving survivors in engaging in advocating for their own rights, and supported by the civil society organization, for instance, Stewardwomen, and other stakeholders within the justice system. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ingrid.
Thank you, Alice. It's so interesting to hear about the whole experience, about not just the data collection, not just listening to survivors and their experiences of justice and what they face, those terrible challenges they face in trying to access justice and within the justice system. But the next steps, I think, is so positive in terms of taking and empowering survivors towards action plans and work plans to really try and drive change themselves. And it's so important to hear that. And I'm so grateful, Alice, for you sharing your experience. I'd now like to turn to our final panel contribution and our final panel member, Laurel Baig. Laurel Baig is a senior appeals counsel at the International Residual Mechanism for the Criminal Tribunals. She was also a key contributor, as was Priya, actually, which I didn't mention before, but was a key contributor to the ICTY's lessons learned on conflict-related sexual violence. So now turning to Laurel, as a prosecutor, and I know as an enthusiastic capacity builder, could you please share your thoughts on the importance of recognizing and tackling stigma within justice processes and how you've used some of the stigma tools in training prosecutors around the world?
Hi, everybody. Really a huge thank you to Synergy for bringing us all together today. It's really an honor to be here. Ingrid, as you just acknowledged, over the past 10 years, my colleagues and I at the UN Residual Mechanism have been convening and participating in a number of primarily peer-to-peer workshops with prosecutors from a diverse range of national jurisdictions. And most of these jurisdictions are in Africa and in Europe, consistent with our primary mandate. And in every single, I don't think I'm overstating this, but in every single training or seminar or workshop, as soon as we begin to share our experiences and listen to the experiences of our national counterparts, our conversation always turns to the topic of stigma. And stigma is inevitably identified as a barrier to justice, not just at the international level, but in every single national jurisdiction that we've connected with. It's really a universal challenge that interferes with our work and the work of everybody who's seeking justice. And it operates on so many levels, I think has been reflected today from the other speakers. And we've seen this on the international stage. We've seen the fear of facing stigma being identified as one of the key reasons that survivors of sexual violence hesitate to come forward. And witnesses feared identifying others who suffered sexual violence because it risked impacting the lives of these other people or their memory. And our investigations in the early days were not prepared for this. They weren't prepared for this reality of facing stigma across cultures and the preparation that that was going to require. And it's totally understandable when you look back. The investigators themselves are carrying the baggage of the myths and stereotypes from their own systems into the international investigations, just like we all are. And my office has been very forthcoming in both the ICTY legacy project that Ingrid just mentioned and that Priya was a very important contributor to, and in the ICTY legacy study, in surfacing some of the shortcomings that we faced and the best practices that emerged from those studies. And in working in those projects, we identified many examples of stigma and the various stereotypes that propel it, playing a role in our internal decision-making at important pressure points. So as prosecutors, do we charge male sexual violence as rape, or is it better just to consider that as inhumane treatment? Should we accept a guilty plea that admits to murder but not to sexual violence? Should we appeal this rape acquittal? And we've gone to court to challenge instances where judges have placed a higher evidentiary or legal standard on sexual violence as compared to other crimes. So we see it all through our system. And these same issues exist in parallel in national systems around the world. Victims fear the social impact of lodging a complaint. Police and prosecutors, when they're making their decisions, they're subject to the same social pressures, the same misconceptions about what evidence is required or what evidence should exist. And we see there too, just as we see at the international level, that judges have expectations. And these expectations are not just based on the strict requirements of the law, but also on their own training and their own experience and the things that they see in their community. and of course, the stereotypes and the stigma that are pervasive everywhere. So we've seen, for example, in many of the places that we're working, that even when it's not legally required, medical evidence, which came up earlier, is often almost either formally or informally mandatory to prove sexual violence. And in some cases, in some places, this can include invasive procedures like virginity tests or measures of the survivor's vaginas. And when judges expect this kind of evidence from the doctors to support the fact that a rape occurred, how can police and prosecutors work to overcome this? And this is a really practical example. I chose this example because it's a really practical example of where Synergy stigma materials have been invaluable in our teaching. So I was lucky enough to have an early version of some of the tools shared with me, particularly the debunker. And I formally tested the materials in one training in Ghana and shared an early version with prosecutors and sought their feedback. But I've also used the information in subsequent teaching events, and it has really revolutionized my teaching approach. And for that, I'm really grateful to Synergy. So thanks to the creativity and research, we have available now to all of us a really practical breakdown of different manifestations of stigma. And more important, we have tools and information that can help us counter that. So now when I'm working with prosecutors from countries where judges expect this kind of medical evidence, we don't just discuss the strategies in the abstract, but we have now at our fingertips the scientific studies. We have, materials that were developed on the basis of experts and expert experience, experts, some of whom are survivors themselves, and their learning and experience is passed on to us through these very practical tools. So using the debunker, just to give an example of one of the things that we're doing, we can take a decision with a group of prosecutors that we are all going to use the information in the debunker to systematically push back against the medical evidence requirement. And the scientific studies that are contained in the debunker, it's a funny word, it's hard to say, the debunker. The scientific studies that are contained therein show that more than 40% of rape survivors do not have injuries that would show up in a medical exam. And the darker skin can make it more difficult for a doctor to observe or record those kinds of injuries. And if a prosecutor uses this information to educate the judges systematically, including in cases where there is medical evidence, if you present it and you say, Your Honors, here is the medical evidence. I need to emphasize that medical evidence like this isn't always available. And, it can be useful where it shows something, but just because it doesn't show something, that doesn't mean that nothing happened. Then we can begin to collectively chip away at the expectations that there will always be medical evidence, that there will always be marks or lesions in every single case. And then if we do that, if everybody agrees to do that, if all the prosecutors in a particular region begin to do that kind of education through each of their cases, when we end up with a case that falls into the 40% where there isn't the medical evidence that would give the kind of details that the judges are subconsciously or consciously expecting, then the judges are already educated and the police are already educated and everybody through the system is already educated that just because there isn't medical evidence doesn't mean that there wasn't a sexually violent attack. And I just want to make a couple of points about the debunker and the project. I think it's not surprising that parts of this project emerge out of the international experience of prosecuting conflict-related sexual violence, because international justice requires people to work across cultural lines and cultural barriers. And it brings together prosecutors and other justice actors, judges, investigators, from all across the globe. And because we're each coming to this project with baggage, with our own stereotypes, with our own preconceptions from our national systems, I think this crucible of international justice was a situation that surfaced some of these hidden assumptions that we all carried, but we could see them when they might have been hidden had they been shared by everybody in the room. And the extreme context of an armed conflict can also shed light on what is essential and what is dispensable in terms of proving that sexual violence happened. Lots of our international cases don't have medical evidence, and yet we were able to prove on the basis of witness evidence alone what happened. But these insights in the toolkit, I think they're also incredibly valuable to national level justice actors. So not just when they are prosecuting international crimes, which is, of course, the future of all of this, but also when they're seeking justice for domestic sexual violence crimes. And the lesson in this debunker, the language tool, the defense tool, all the rest of these things that I think Ingrid is going to show us, by teaching us how to identify stigma, to identify these stereotypes, and educating us all on how to counter it when we see it, how to speak with more dignity towards other people, and to educate, giving us the tools to educate the people around us, the people we work with, and the people in our spheres on stigma's existence and its harm. I think this toolkit is really poised, I guess is the right word, poised to make a really big difference to everyone whose lives have been affected by sexual violence and all of the professionals that are seeking justice on their behalf. And not just in the international arena, but I think in domestic systems around the world. So I'm really grateful to be able to speak in favor of this. I found it to be an incredibly useful tool, and I'm very confident that others are going to see how practical and thoughtful and well-developed this material is. So congratulations to Synergy.
Thank you, Laurel. I'm so delighted that the tools have been so useful already, and we're here today to try and expand the knowledge of the tools and potentially find do exactly what Laurel just said to make sure that we can get the tools into the hands of people where they can make a difference, but also into the hands of people who can teach us how to make them better. So we thought we would do a very brief introduction to the tools. So Karina, if you could put the slide set up, please. I'm just going to talk the audience through these tools in a very brief way. I mean, obviously, digging into them is going to be far more useful. So I can't see the slide set myself, but I believe that you should have a slide in front of you that's just the introductory slide. Someone can nod at me. So if we have the first slide up, this actually at the bottom, along the bottom of this slide, you can see the front covers of the different tools that currently exist. Can everyone see the slides yet?
Not yet, Ingrid. One second.
Well, I'll continue to talk, and then someone can give me the nod when they're up. So over the last 3 years, as Synergy, as Christy mentioned at the start, Synergy has been developing this Stigma Injustice Toolkit. It really has been this sort of response to many, many questions in the international space and also in the national space about, what can we do to actually improve justice? Why are we so bad at justice for sexual violence? And Stigma repeatedly seems to be the answer. There's a lot of data in the domestic system about prosecuting broader forms of sexual violence, that stigma has a huge role in attrition rates. And I think anecdotally, and you can hear this from Priya, from Laurel, from myself, and from other prosecutors, investigators, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence of just why things went wrong along the way. So this is where these tools came from. They have two parts and a growing number of components, which I'll explain. They were developed by a team of multidisciplinary experts that include, critically and at the heart of it, survivor experts, mental health and trauma experts, forensic experts, investigators, prosecutors, judges, victim advocates, and defense counsel. The main tool, part A, which I'll describe in a second, has been through a sort of consultation with practitioners working in different types of legal systems along the whole spectrum of common law to civil law and everything in between, which most things are these days, but also in different types of contexts and settings, in active conflicts, as well as low resource settings, etc. So we could move to the next slide. So part A is the largest kind of central tool in the toolkit. It's a competency-based indicator and assessment framework. Now that sounds like a lot. I'll give you a little glimpse at it so you can see what we mean by that. But it's essentially a framework through which you can kind of review how the system or how functions in the system are doing. As well as it being a roadmap to how you might develop or build capacity. It's divided by function. So it's got 9 chapters that go from legislation, which I know has been a key focus about getting the law right. But it also talks about access to justice, support services, witness protection, investigation and prosecution, forensic examinations, and adjudication and court services for the judges. It has 3 sort of thematic strands that run through all of those chapters. And so all of the indicators are divided between these thematic strands. The first is organizational culture and leadership, which is critical to tackling institutionalized stigma. The second is survivor engagement and interaction, so really understanding survivors' experiences of the justice process. And lastly is technical understanding and competency. So at the kind of technical level, at the practitioner level, what do they know, what is their attitude, and what is their practice? Each indicator provides for elements of good practice for that indicator. It has an assessment scale to help you measure and monitor change. It has some key critical questions to ask in the review, as well as where you would look for your main data sources. Most of the indicators also have a section on helpful resources, but we did find there was a gap here when it came to stigma, and so some of those gaps we've tried to fill ourselves. If we could move on to the next slide, this is a glimpse at an extract from the toolkit. And those of you who are trying to look at this on a mobile phone, you are going to struggle. We tried to squeeze it all in, but let me talk you through it. Essentially, what you can see at the top in the blue banner is an indicator. It's one of the judge's indicators. And immediately underneath each indicator is elements of good practice. So a basic set of what good practice looks like for that indicator. And then an assessment grid. So based on those elements of good practice, you can see where you are and tick the elements underneath which best reflect what's going on in your system or in your function. And really this grid gives you the ability to understand where you should be prioritizing things for improvement. But also, if you look at the ingredients, I guess, of the other columns, it gives you this roadmap of where to go next or how to build on where you've got to. Slide 4, please. So who can use this toolkit? I think initially when we were looking at it, we were kind of focused on the internal justice actors, but we've realized that, and we've developed it based on a much wider pool of potential users. So of course, internal justice actors who are responsible for their functions can use this tool to improve their function in those 3 main thematic areas. External actors can also use this. Now, of course, their data will be different and maybe more limited from an internal user, what they'll have access to in terms of that information. But there are government oversight bodies, there's civil society and survivor networks who do have a lot of information and experience of accessing or going through different parts of the justice process, who will be able to collect data. And for them, this is about a robust evidence-based approach to advocating for change. We also think, as I mentioned, I sort of touched on, we also think that this tool could be for newly developed mechanisms. So for a new prosecutor's office or a new CRSV unit within a prosecutor's office, for example, perhaps they could use this as a roadmap or a model to move to develop their own systems and practice, and really to kind of develop their capacity and monitor their capacity based on this framework. And lastly, I think critically, for monitoring, evaluation, learning experts, for capacity builders with justice projects or donors who are funding them, this is a set of measurements. This is a way to actually, potentially in the indicators to see whether something is working, whether progress is being made. These are benchmarks potentially that work can be, that projects can be monitored against. So just to note, I mean, if you look at Part A, it's a big beast. If you look at it as a whole, it's extremely big, and we don't imagine that it would be used in its entirety. That would obviously be an ideal situation to review the entire system and process. We think it's much more likely that its use is per chapter, so investigation, a police department investigation unit looking at the investigation chapter, using it to monitor, to assess and identify key areas for change. I think it's also possible, and this is what we did in South Sudan, was to pick a thematic area. So we chose for South Sudan, we chose survivor interactions and engagement, and looked at that specifically in access to justice. So we used 5 sets of indicators, just a small part of one chapter, to look at one thematic aspect. And then, of course, this is also a toolkit that allows you to pick indicators. So you could, if there's an indicator that matches the project or the capacity building goals or objectives, then individual indicators might be useful in and of themselves, separate from the whole toolkit. If we could move to the next slide. A very quick introduction to the Part B tools. So as I said, as we were developing Part A, we were looking for helpful resources that help people with their kind of assessment and to understand what good practice was. And we found huge gaps around sort of particularly stigma injustice issues and at the international level, or specifically dealing with conflict-related sexual violence. So we've created an initial set of 4 tools that are available in English, Spanish, French, and Ukrainian. And these tools include the debunker, as Laurel mentioned, the myth debunker. The myth debunker identifies 8 of the most significant myths about conflict-related sexual violence, and these include what it is, amazingly, expectations of use of force and medical evidence, consent issues, credibility and delayed reporting, what trauma looks like and understanding the effects of trauma, what perpetrators look like, and some of the myths around that, trivialization and minimization. I think this is incredibly important, and also one that Priya mentioned, which is honor and shame. So the debunker seeks to identify these myths, provides the facts, the science, and authoritative materials that help counter those myths, explains and gives examples of how they manifest injustice to help with that recognition point, and then also suggests more comprehensive ways of trying to debunk those myths, both on a, as Laurel pointed out, a kind of case-by-case education basis, but some of these broader ones. The second is a guide to stigmatizing, non-stigmatizing language. This was developed by 2 incredible survivor experts. One is Nadine, who was on our panel, and the other is Philomene, who I can see is in our audience today and asking questions. This is an incredible guide that has explanations, examples, tip sheets, checklists. It's one of the tools that I keep picking up because I keep trying to raise my awareness about some of the language that I use and not to fall into some of the common myths or language that can be minimizing or can be, can cause harm. So it's been, for me, this is a resource that I keep picking up and picking up. The third tool is the Defense Guide to Good Practice. I think this is a very unique tool. It's a critical resource. It was developed by 5 amazing female victim advocates and defense counsel that work at the international level. They interviewed and drew on the expertise of 18 other experienced defense counsel, victim advocates and representatives, judges and prosecutors. And the sort of quotes and practical tips from those experts are really centered in this guide. So I'm delighted that we have this defense guide. I think it's incredibly useful, and I hope that it will be used very broadly at the national level and hopefully the international level. The last tool that's already developed is a bank of survey questions. And essentially these are questions that can help you test levels of stigma and myth acceptance, the sort of individual and team level, but also kind of across time. It has case studies with questions that can be useful for training materials, awareness raising, and team development. But really the idea of this tool is to help you with the kind of testing and monitoring of knowledge, attitude, and practice around conflict-related sexual violence. It's originally derived from the Illinois rape myth scale, as well as the male rape myth scales that are covered and tested in the literature, in science, in journals. But it's been adapted specifically to conflict and atrocity-related sexual violence, and it also has regional adaptations and examples that can be developed further. There are some more tools that we are looking at, and we're always welcome to ideas and input about what's missing and what would be helpful in this space. Some of the ones that we are going to work on in the immediate future are training modules for non-stigmatizing, trauma-informed forensic examinations. For those of you who know Synergy, you know this is one of our core areas as well. We're also looking to develop a judge's bench book, prosecutor charging guidelines, and a package of organizational change tools, a kind of leadership program or championing program. There's a lot that tells us already about how to tackle institutionalized stigma. And so there's a lot to learn from other types of stigma, including HIV, drug use, etc. And so we want to kind of create this set of tools that will help organizations tackle it, and create kind of organizational change. One other thing that we are also developing is an extra chapter in the Part A that relates specifically to Truth Commission options. And potentially we hope in the future to make progress on a reparations chapter as well. So if we could take the slides down. That is a very whirlwind tour of the tools, and obviously, it helps if you can actually look at them and dig deep into them. But that hopefully will become a next step as we grow our network and grow our partnerships and collaboration. And so I turn to Lisa, who is our project manager. She's going to talk to us a little bit more about how different ways partners can get involved and help road test or improve these tools through work.
Thank you, Ingrid, and also thank you for presenting the Stigma Toolkit in more details. So I also have a PowerPoint presentation, so if you could please share it with the audience. Thank you. So I am very happy to now present you what are the next steps, their objective, but also how you can concretely get involved and use the toolkit in your work. So I will wait for you to see the slide. So we already saw from the panelists how the toolkit has been already an incredible and useful resource. And we are now entering a new exciting phase, which will take place until March 2027, where we really want to continue to test and improve the toolkit on a more global level so that it is accessible and also meets the diverse need of judicial actors, but also support service providers, civil society organizations, and most importantly, the needs of survivors. So that by the end of this piloting and road setting phase, our goal is really to have a practical, user-friendly reference tool to counter stigma associated to conflict-related sexual violence and to ensure that the justice journey for survivors uphold the highest standards for them. So to achieve the objective, the collaboration and partnership with different categories of users of the toolkit will be key. And we are really eager to collaborate with local CSO working with survivors, but also support service providers, forensic services, judicial actors, such as prosecutors, defense lawyers, and of course with survivors and survivors network, as their voices is really at the center of this project. So really this collaboration to test the toolkit, I want to insist with diverse partners as possible, is key as it will allow us to gather different perspectives that can be reflected in the toolkit. So the more we receive feedback, the more the toolkit will be enriched and tailored to the different needs and experiences of a variety of key stakeholders that are working to address stigma. So during this pilot phase, we also aim to pilot the toolkit in diverse legal systems, so in common law system, but also in civil legal law system, and also in different contexts, such as conflict context, but also transitional context, and also post-conflict context, to ensure the toolkit, to ensure its global relevance and effectiveness. So again, the objective of this pilot and host taking phase is really to gather user feedbacks, your feedback on the toolkit, either as a survivor network, either as a judicial actor, a CSO, or support service provider, as it will really help us to draw some lessons based on your practical use of the toolkit to make it even more impactful, so that at the end of the pilot phase, this toolkit is really this go-to resource and a reference tool for countering stigma in justice system, create change and equip actors with best standards, and significantly improve the justice journey of survivors. So we don't want to create sort of static documents that sit on our website, but we want to have a living and practical tool that is used to bring real change in survivor lives and justice system globally. So how you can get involved in this testing phase and how it can be used in your work. So we can move to the next slide, please. So first, you can pilot and road test the toolkit. This means using and testing the tools and chapters that Ingrid just presented that you think are relevant to support your work to counter stigma. So to do that, we invite you to simply reach out to us. And I think we will share in a moment our contact details. And then you can start by exploring in more detail the toolkit to identify the chapters and tools that align with your work that you would consider testing. Then we can organize bilateral call to explore together how it can be beneficial to support your work and explain also in more detail the practical modalities of collaboration. Another way to engage in a more formal partnership is to answer our call for project. So we've recently released the call for project for local CSO, survivor networks, women organization, support service provider to pilot the toolkit at their local level. So we are particularly eager to partner, to establish partnership with local organizations that are working with domestic justice system and survivor networks. But also we are, of course, very eager to pilot the toolkit directly with survivor networks, as survivors, as I said earlier, are at the center of this project. And we want to make sure to include their voices and feedback. So the objective of this call is to pilot one or several chapters of the toolkit that were presented earlier and that are of interest for your organization, such as, for instance, it could be access to justice, witness protection, or investigation. And the goal is to increase the recognition about justice institutions and key actors of how stigma related to survivor of CRSV affect the progress of their cases and their road to justice. Another important outcomes under this call will also be for your organization to provide your own recommendation based on the experience and direct input of survivors and other key actors of the justice process. The pilot will last between 6 to 18 months. And because of time constraints, I invite you to consult the call guidelines that are on our website. So I think we will share it on the chat box so that you can read in more details the guidelines. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out to us. If you have questions, we would be happy to provide answers and help you to draft the project and answer your question. So now in terms of how to use the toolkit, I will just give a few examples because of time constraint. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it will just give you an idea. So first, you can use the toolkit to conduct sort of internal audit using the assessment framework to help you identify what's working well, where the gaps are, and what needs to be improved in your area of work. It's enable you to pinpoint practices or policies or perception within your organization or sector you are working in that may perpetuate stigma. The second use can be also it could also be a useful resource for drafting evidence database advocacy report and publication, as we saw and explained by Alice earlier in South Sudan, because with the data you collect directly from key judicial stakeholders and from survivors themselves, you can build strong evidence-based advocacy materials and reports that really tell a story and push for a change. Also, the toolkit and the tools that Ingrid presented can be used as awareness-raising material as such and reference tools, and can also be used to develop and deliver training for justice actors, civil society organizations, service providers, to ensure they are equipped to address stigma and misconception when interacting with survivors. So, for instance, the guide to non-stigmatizing language, the myth debunker, can be used to train defense lawyers to ensure they are aware of their own bias when they cross-examine survivor testimonies, for instance. And on a side note, I have attended the trial in France of Giselle Pellico that Priya alluded to earlier, and I could see how this tool could have been beneficial for several defense lawyers who have perpetuated stigma and victim blaming during their pleadings. Well, the toolkit can also be a useful resource to design your projects and programs where stigma is prevalent. It can support the design of impactful projects and programs, as well as strategic planning efforts to include indicators related to stigma. It can also be used for designing projects and support strategic planning efforts. It can also be a great resource for drafting or refining standard operating procedure and improve practices with regard to stigma. And finally, you can also use the toolkit to measure the outcome of your project, track progress, and ensure they deliver meaningful improvement for survivors at the justice system targeting by your program. So whatever the way you choose to use the toolkit, as you saw, it's very diverse. We would like to hear from you. And as I mentioned earlier, we are currently in the piloting phase, which means we are actively looking for ways to enhance the toolkit. So let us know by providing your recommendation, what worked well, what could be improved based on your specific use, so that we can incorporate your insight into the final version. And of course, we also be of support during the pilot phase. So Synergy will provide support to its partner, whether it is under a more formal partnership or also for project users. So during this pilot phase, we will provide training session, and this session will help you understand the methodology behind the toolkit, how to do data collection in line with survivor-centered approach, and to present you with, in more detail, the key chapter. We will also provide you with structured template for recommendation and lesson learned and reporting in order to make it more easy for you to contribute to refining the toolkit. And finally, for partners who are going to be selected under the call for project, we will provide additional support, as the partner will also receive technical support from an expert facilitator who will provide guidance to address their unique needs during the project, and also provide data collection tools. So really our goal is to ensure you feel equipped during this piloting phase, and we want to really support you throughout this phase to, at the end, refine and enhance further the toolkit. So how to contact us? So I think now we can move to the next slide. So feel free to reach out to us at this address. We would be happy to organize a bilateral meeting and discuss how the toolkit could be beneficial to your work, and discuss in more detail the practical modalities for collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And we really would welcome all communications and everyone to reach out. We really do want to make sure that these tools are as useful as possible and the best that they can be. And the only way we can do that is through your help, through your testing, through your feedback and recommendations. We want to create a really good set of tools that change the way that we do justice for conflict-related sexual violence. We are at time. It's always my timekeeping that gets me, but we perhaps have time for 1 or 2 questions if attendees will bear with us. I know we're after time, but for those of us who would like to stay for the discussion, we would welcome you staying. We've had a couple of questions coming up on the Q&A, particularly from Philomene. I wondered whether, Philomene, you wanted to ask at least one of your questions or make a comment. We open Philomene's mic.
Can you hear me?
A little bit quiet, Philomene.
Can you hear me?
There, that's it.
Yeah. A couple of questions because the time, I think I'll just pick one question because I don't think you'll be able to go through them. So my question I want to pick is more focusing on strategies. What strategies can be implemented to strengthen collaboration between healthcare professionals and justice actors to reduce the stigma against victims of sexual violence in conflict settings? Because as you know, victims of sexual violence, they are more likely to be in touch with the healthcare professionals. Professions can become quite proactive partners and to justice actors to help really fight this stigma issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Philomene. I'm going to ask the panel if anyone in particular wants to answer it. If not, I can field this one. Anyone on the panel want to? Okay, I will answer it. Philomene, it's such a...
Sorry.
Oh, Nadine, please, yes.
I mean, shortly, maybe. I was just going to say, if, it's mandatory requirement to ensure that survivors who seek justice have support services first, prioritizing the well-being and care, and then, they can engage with the justice actors. So that would be my short answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine. Actually, I was going to say something similar. I think, we have a problem in the justice system that we almost try to take victims out of the support systems that they have and recreate our own. And I think sometimes that can, it's not as supportive as it should be. And actually, survivors may already be part of and hopefully be part of a support network, either through the medical care or other service providers, and where we can find ways of going to them as opposed to pulling them out and insisting that they're in our locations, in our offices, coming to us for these things, I think is really important. I think coordination, I think it's incredibly important to have a good relationship and a good set of shared working tools between those who will refer into justice systems as well as the people within the justice systems who receive people. And of course, trauma-informed approaches, I think, are absolutely critical. And that I think that is not a skill that's taught often in justice actors or in justice systems, even though it's increasingly part of a medical response or a psychosocial response. Is there any other questions? Got one hand up. Let me see if I can figure out whose hand it is. Priscilla.
Yes.
Hello, your hand is up.
Hello. How are you all? Yes, it is. Good afternoon. And it's really good being here. It's been so informative and enlightening and yeah, bringing it all together. I wanted to just quickly touch on one of the challenges we have, which is working with survivors, but who want to remain anonymous. So I'm trying to see how best and what would be the good practices using the toolkit to support them to seek this justice and accountability they're yearning for, yet still, because of stigma, societal pressures, and including from their own community, they are not able to come out and speak about issues so freely. So we're working with a group of them, a number of them, including even having actors anonymize their stories in a documentary. So that is one component of how we're engaging with them. MHPSS and other social support, they're also part and parcel of the support we're getting from the UN Fund for Victims of Torture. So that's all that which can happen outside of the justice system, but they also want justice and accountability. So whatever guidance and support would be, we can use to harness that and would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Priscilla. What an excellent question. Anyone on the panel want to answer that? Otherwise, of course, I'll have a go as well. You can. A quiet panel. It is a tricky question, Priscilla. It's an excellent one. I think, you know, one of the things the toolkit does emphasize is confidentiality and witness protection. And I think, you know, when we are working with survivors, confidentiality, privacy, and making sure that we have extremely robust systems of confidentiality are incredibly important. So that's an overall theme across all justice functions. I think when it comes to anonymity, it's not a word we often use in justice because of the defense right to challenge. So there are some systems in which total anonymity, including to the defense, is allowed. But in those systems, there also has to be additional evidence because the defense right to challenge is not there. So there are strategies that can be used. There are, for example, at the international tribunals, there are things like delayed disclosure to the defense. As I said, in some systems, there is the ability to have total anonymity. But yeah, our criminal justice system is not geared up for survivors. This is one of the problems. And so there's sort of multiple, it's how to take the systems and make the best use of the protections that you have available, including operational confidentiality measures, as well as procedural confidentiality measures where they are there, and to ensure that you're building a case that matches what the survivor needs and wants, as well as meeting the evidential rules and requirements. So it's not an easy thing to do when survivors want to remain totally anonymous, and perhaps is not permitted in some jurisdictions, but there are some scope for it in others. Sorry, that's not a comprehensive answer, Priscilla, that I know that you're looking for, but in terms of your interaction with justice actors, I would be looking for assurances and to do due diligence around how they maintain confidentiality, protect the privacy, both operationally and as part of the procedural part of justice. We also have hands up from Manal. I think Manal, and you'd also ask some questions, so I'd love to open the mic and if you have a comment or a question or for any particular panelist or in general, you're more than welcome.
So, hi. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I'm trying to put my camera on, but I couldn't. I don't know how.
That's okay. I think because it's a webinar format, the camera, we can't open the camera, but we can open the mic.
It's not actually a question. It's more about reflection about what's happening in my country in Sudan in terms of conflict-related sexual violence and how actually it's been underreported, underdocumented, very few effort that given attention to this effort. Of course, the stigma is actually hindering and jeopardize a lot of documentations in a proper way to be legally presented. Even we have the fact mission committee that was sponsored by European Unions and Americans and the UN. And when they went there, the data they collected, it was not actually to represent for any justice now. So the idea is, I want to say, like, usually we compromise and we politically sell the justice for women versus political agreements and political compromisations. And Sudan experienced 2 genocides. The one in 2003 in Darfur, and now recently announced one. The amount of effort from international community, especially women organizations, legal communities that working in gender, if you compare it to any other countries, it's very minimal, because we don't see like a lot of documentations on these cases in Sudan. We don't see people talk about it in the media. We don't see it as going to our peace processes. So, and there's no support for the trauma. That's why we have this proactive conflict every time, and then we have this, because this issue of informed peace processes that informed by our trauma is not being handled seriously, and that's also part of the legal system is not really functioning. So the idea how we can really, as Sudanese women, have a very limited resources. We've been closed for 30 years from international organizations because of the sanctions and because of a lot of things happening on our past. How we can really get the attention of what's happening now, because for me, we just knock every door. I was in Port Sudan, just for this Christmas, and I saw houses of like shelters being supported by the government, but for girls and some women, they have kids out of rape, and those kids cannot be, by the legal system, cannot go like they cannot be like adopted by their family, and those girls were still out of their families, so they're staying there, and there's a very limited support for them, and there is no documentation for their cases, and the rape happened to them. Those kids out of the rape, they also the stigma goes even to those kids in country like Sudan. So these kind of piled up issues, it's not being touched. So when I saw this webinar and I see the legal aspect of it, and I see that you may have training, I feel like there is opening here. So I want to just continue on whoever. I'm gonna please share my email with whoever here, especially people want to have some access to document some cases that can really be used for legal purpose in the future. So I'm happy to do a facilitator for this. We need your help. As a Sudanese woman, we need your help.
Thank you, Manal.
Thank you.
And you just you just raised awareness with all of the attendees here. Thank you for sharing what's going on in Sudan and the lack of response there. I mean, I always look through things through a stigma lens. So I'm thinking about this minimization of the experience of women and the minimization of experience of survivors and the silencing. So I hope people do reach out to you. I do hope that you get support in your work. It's incredibly important. Do reach out to us, Manal, if you have ideas about how you could use the toolkit and that we could help at all. In relation to Sudan, we'd love to hear from you. And as I said, I'm hugely grateful.
I sent you an email. I sent an email. Yeah, I'm planning to use it in Sudan for training for some organizations that they are working on this specific area.
Fabulous. That's really good to hear. Thank you. And we have one more person with their hand up. That's Ronald. Ronald, would you like to ask a question or share a comment or insight? Ronald, do we still have you? Okay. Ronald,
hello?
are you with us? Yes.
Hello,
hello,
you
Ronald.
can hear me? Oh,
yes,
great. Oh, okay. I joined in from Rwanda, actually, with the International Bridges to Justice. It's an organization I work with currently. So my question actually in particular in regard to the tools, so much focuses on the growing trend in terms of the online violence, sexual violence. There's been some kind of difficulty in terms of really taking on some kind of accountability in terms of making sure that there is strict follow-up when it comes to that. For example, some of the specific technologies or tools that are currently being used to monitor online platforms for instances of sexual violence is what actually I'm thinking about in terms of how that can be developed to be able to really have that effective or automated systems that detect or flag the potential causes of online sexual violence. Because I believe, of course, as we look at the aspect of the physical sexual violence, there's also going to be in turn an aspect to do with the online, because nowadays very many people get to interact with different platforms, and some of them actually, even when they come up to give out like some kind of opinion or something, they're attacked in a different way or something like that. So of course, it's something that is really very hard to trace, especially even for the prosecutors. For example, if someone is in a different jurisdiction, it's sometimes very hard to follow up, and also sometimes hard to trace. So I think also, I don't know if you can consider that in terms of most probably future tools that you may think of in terms of seeing how these tools can be developed further to be able to assist even those that are trying to address issues for online sexual violence, if possible, and also see ways on how people can really structure different systems. For example, the working conditions, because sometimes, as the lady from South Sudan highlighted, that sometimes the working conditions are not really good. You might find that the working conditions for a given jurisdiction might favor most probably addressing this kind of issues on sexual violence, but other jurisdictions also may be having difficult, depending on the conditions, such as most probably the funding. And I think, to me, when I look at that, what he was pointing out is that sometimes these departments don't get enough budgets. For example, if a country has different priorities when it comes to budgeting, these issues are not looked at as being important, and that's why you find like the Justice Department sometimes is given less money, like for more than the Defense Department. So those are some of the challenges I see really which hinder the working conditions to be able to address these kinds of situations, to me. So thank you very much for this. Really, it was really great. I got a lot of insights from it. And I hope to get in touch with one of you so that we see how to really connect and have some trainings down here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronald. It's such interesting issues that you raise. I'm going to deal with them very briefly because they're not really specifically stigma, but the online forms of sexual violence, as you say, are incredibly important that we are recognizing them and tackling them. The monitoring of online platforms is done, but I think there are there are ethical and survivor-centered issues around open source research or internet research to try and detect and trace these crimes, as you said. There is, and I'm going to plug the Institution for International Criminal Investigations, the IICI, is working with the Berkeley Institute to create some guidance on how to do on sort of open source research work around conflict-related sexual violence or other issues. I would also mention that I think there's a lot to be learned from the safeguarding of people involved in those types of investigations and the safeguarding of survivors from child sexual assault or abuse material and the work that's done online with that. I think there's all sorts of hashtagging and tools that help you detect issues and help monitor online forms of violence, but slightly separate from stigma. But that's what I would kind of highlight in terms of where to go with that, Ronald. And lastly, your point on working conditions as well. And I think it's really important that any toolkit recognizes that there are many situations where there are low resources or budget deprioritization, and that's why these tools actually have to be as practical as possible to suggest not just things that take a lot of budget, but things that are operational, that can be done easily, that are, as long as there's somebody in a job, that they can do some of these things. So I think it's really important as we road test these tools that we make sure that they work in low resource and budget deprioritized areas. Sorry, getting to the end, I've just lost my voice. So I'm gonna wrap us up there. Thank you everyone for staying longer. Thank you for all the questions and comments. They're incredibly valuable. That brings us to the end today, a little bit late. I hope you all agree it's been a very rich and insightful discussion. I'm incredibly grateful to our incredible panelists today, Priya, Alice, Nadine, and Laurel. Thank you all for helping take this conversation forward. I'm also incredibly grateful for the management team at Synergy, who have been very enthusiastically and effectively supporting this work for the last few years and ongoing. And a thanks to our donors at different stages of this process for believing in what we're trying to achieve and understanding the issues. And most of all today, a huge thank you to the audience. Thank you for sticking with us, even though we went over in terms of our discussion. We do hope that this is the first of many webinars, future meetings, roundtables, conferences that we will be able to discuss this issue with you or work with you on these issues. And we really do look forward to hearing from you. So please do send us an email. As Lisa pointed out, it can be a very informal version of collaboration. If you like the idea of one of the tools and you want to road test it in a project you have, let us know and we can give you that. And and all we ask in return is some feedback and recommendations about the tool once you've used it. How important it was, what could be changed to make it better, what could be more practical. So again, we really look forward to hearing from you. We hope that you will all be partners with us as we take this work forward and try to make some meaningful change in terms of how we do justice for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. I hope you all have a lovely day, and we will be in touch, I hope. Thank you, everyone.